Greetings and welcome back to another iteration of MGTOW Talks. Today I am here with the inimitable High Lord Medicus Niko Choski. We're going to be talking about a very interesting topic today, several topics that maybe conventionally would not be perceived as directly related to MGTOW, but they are deeply interesting and important ethical questions, what it means to be a doctor, what it means to be a human being, the whole, that is the sum of parts, ultimately leading up to being a human being, life, death, euthanasia, and things of that nature. So it's an important discussion, not just for the MGTOW community to have, but for human beings to have in general. But we do have this overwhelming tendency to shy away from that. And as the discussion proceeds, I think we'll also get to the reason as to why that's the case. So with that said, welcome back, Niko. You are most welcome here, as always.
Thank you. Thank you.
I think the best way to start this is to talk about, before we move on to some of the related stuff, talk about the nature of the medical profession. And we talked about this a little bit, how you kind of have to transcend your perception of human beings, and you kind of have to look at them as chunks of meat, no matter what feelings you might have for humanity. Can you tell us about this process, where it starts, and how it makes you more effective or doesn't make you more effective?
Well, that is a very interesting question. And like I said, when we were discussing privately before about this, it depends what you do in medicine, and it depends where you are and in what field. Surgery comes to mind when you're describing something like that because the surgeons are basically operating on a single part of the human body. If you notice, in preparations for surgery, the face is covered and the surgeons are mainly focused on that part of the body. They don't really care about anything else. The physiology is mainly controlled by the anesthetist. So for all intents and purposes, a lot of the surgeons, during the procedure at least, they view that human being as just that part that's broken and just needs to be fixed. You start medical school and you start doing all these touchy-feely subjects. You speak about sociology, ethics, you speak about morality, you speak about utilitarian ethics, and a lot of ethics actually. And as you proceed and as you come to the real world, you understand that perhaps how patients, the world views doctors is a very unrealistic expectation. The fact that you will take on your shoulders the problems of everyone else, feel their problems as your own, and then still be able to act in such a way that is towards their overall health, let's say, and maintaining their current state, prolonging their life expectancy and giving them a good quality of life, is an unreasonable expectation, I believe. And a lot of the doctors initially start their careers really engaging with their patients, really caring for each patient, and as they progress through their careers, they start viewing them as numbers. Eventually, they see them as potential problems that need solving, and it's a whole process of almost dehumanization. Doesn't mean that they don't do their job well. They do their job brilliantly. And if they are to see those patients outside, they will treat them completely as human beings. But
now, if I might interject to ask a question, would you say that, apart from perhaps certain sectors of the medical field, particularly in American it's trauma, but in say an emergency situation or doctors that are dealing with potentially terminal illnesses, that dehumanization process that you had just described is absolutely not only is it inevitable, but it's necessary in order to function and function efficiently?
I think yes. I think if you're coming across people that you view as friends, perhaps if you develop relationships, if you feel their pain, if you completely empathize with them, and you feel a deep connection with them, and then you see those people, especially in acute settings, in oncology, in settings where people are potentially going to die, and they do die a lot. It is a process where, yeah, dehumanization, I know it's a strong word, but I think it's almost necessary. And doctors will argue a lot of things, but I mean, I'm in there. I see what doctors do and how doctors behave and how they view life. I mean, you can't possibly expect from someone to view you as a friend, treat you as a friend, do everything necessary for you, and then when you eventually pass away, that person needs to mourn for you. Because if you do feel that deep connection with them, you'll end up mourning all the time. So you just put all of these things in a compartment and just lock them away. And when you're in your job, you're basically doing your job.
Yeah, I think that level, I mean, even as an outside observer, I've had as an adult, two surgeries I can remember, one for an inguinal hernia, the other for you always remind me, the
submandibular
salivary gland tumor. And it wasn't shocking, and then I got used to it, but of course they just approached the bed, especially after the surgery, and, man, early 30s, mid 30s, whatever at the time, and, tumor excised, benign, blah, 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 they look, and it seems that it is necessary, given the quantity of patients that are coming in all the time, and there's just sort of no way around that. And you kind of touch on an interesting aspect of this as well, is that, and we talk about this in MGTOW as well. My friend once said, emotions are a useful servant but a terrible master. It seems to me that developing truly empathetic, or rather empathic connections to patients and getting emotionally involved would affect your ability to work efficiently. After all, the human body is sort of a machine. There's these parts and these things that work in unison, and to view the person as a whole, that is the sum of the parts, which inevitably he will be in some sense to some people, takes away from your ability to work efficiently. Would you say that's a good way of summarizing or describing that?
Well, like you said, for example, that what you described is a ward round. In a ward round, any patient, to use you as an example, for example, will be patient mid-30s male, admitted for a salivary gland tumor excision, which was performed. Then observations for the patient are normal. The site of the operation seems to not have any evidence of infection there, healing well, can be discharged home. It will be something like that, right? When these things happen, you're basically liaising to another doctor or just medical facts. You don't care about how the patient feels or anything like that. All those things are never in conversation between doctors. I mean, depending on the field, obviously, if you're doing psychiatry, emotions are necessary. But if you're doing ENT, where about they excise the tumor like you described, I don't think they particularly care. It's not medically relevant for them.
But we were also talking, I thought that was quite interesting, about psychiatry. And I was mentioning in the mid-2000s, after my very disturbing relationship with a girl with borderline personality disorder, I'd taken on these weird symptoms. It's in German it's called Anpassungsstörung, literally sort of adaptive disturbance. That is to say, you adapt the qualities of because you're so intensely involved with this person. For 2 years I was trying to, quote-unquote, fix the problem. And so I ended up seeing a shrink for maybe 9 months, maybe a year, I don't even remember. And this guy was so sort of sober and just detached from everything. And I knew he had worked in psychiatric wards and dealt with borderliners. He told me that. He knew, how bad it is. But to be honest, he always struck me as having the same level of detachment as would a surgeon. It was just, find the diagnosis and usually just prescribe some sort of medication. Although in my case, he insisted there was nothing wrong with me. It was just this adaptive syndrome thing that, spending too much time with a borderliner. But he opened up a little bit. He told me about his patients. I don't know if he liked me. I think I think he only had daughters, so maybe he always wanted a son. I was young back then.
Yeah.
And it still was always just a very sober description of things. Oh, I have this one patient, and it's manic depression, and it's. So I think even psychiatry, where you think emotions are involved, it is. In my experience, observing this guy and then having conversed with people who involve a psychiatrist, that you probably have more potential for seeing the person as a human being, but inevitably goes down the route of just sort of classifying whatever illness might be present as whatever and proceeding, you know?
Yeah, I mean, for them, can you imagine you keep seeing the same behaviors again and again? You keep seeing the same histories being repeated in front of you. They're thoroughly unimpressed by what they're seeing, right?
Yeah.
And a big part of psychiatry is just sitting back and observing the patient. And you almost need to be in a very relaxed state to do it. And like I said, frontline psychiatry, you come across very disturbed individuals. You come across dangerous individuals at times. And I think it beats the empathy out of people. I think all people start with the best intentions, but as they go on, they just find their ways to deal with it. People turn completely indifferent to what's going on. Some people shut down. I mean, that seems to be the majority of how people deal with the situation, right? A doctor might be coming across as completely nice and empathetic towards you, but you should see that doctor behind closed doors. The doctor will not remember your name, they will not remember your age, possibly not even remember your condition. It's just an act, it's just an autopilot, the caring act that they have. And a lot of the people don't even put the effort to do that. So, it is an adaptive behavior, and it's an adaptive behavior so that you can basically continue living your own life and not take everything home with you.
And I want to get into that in a second, but as an example, in the German healthcare system, the public one, which I can't afford private insurance, so I pay public, doctors have a set fee paid to them each time you visit them with your public insurance card. And yeah, because they never get more than a certain amount, their job is to get you in as fast as possible and get you out. I've been to doctors where I've done a kind of countdown, and it was 2 minutes, in and out. When I get my insomnia medication, which I don't always use, I haven't used it for a couple of weeks now, prescribed, like once a year I get it prescribed. I just walk in and say I need a renewal, and this guy's a neuropsychiatrist, but whatever, he just gives it to me and I leave.
Yeah.
And I think probably it is for the best. Now, you just mentioned something.
Is it? I don't think it's for the best. I mean,
well, hey man, I don't like hanging out at doctors' offices, to be honest. So if I can get in and get out as fast as possible.
Yeah.
I mean, when I had my tumor diagnosed after the NHS had fucked it up 3 or 4 times, identifying it as something to do with the I forgot the English word.
Lymph nodes.
Right. Lymph nodes. And German's a bit dominant sometimes when I think about medical stuff. And yeah, I got there and I went to this doctor and he just looked at it. This guy was old, so he'd seen everything, 70. Oh, yep,
submandibular.
Submandibular salary. He writes me like a mandate or whatever and sends me off, and then 2 weeks later I get my surgery. So it was just quick and efficient. He didn't try to ask me things. He just looked at it, knew what it was, and that was it. And I kind of appreciate that approach.
I mean, you have to appreciate as well that there is other types of patients that will need to come to terms with things, patients that will be completely shocked by the news straight away and will need time with their doctors to heal. I think the problem with National Health Service in the UK and National Health Service in general in every country is that there is no incentive for any doctor to put any more effort. Right? And instead of giving them positive incentives, what's happening right now in the UK is that you're getting negative incentives. So your wage is actually not brilliant, right? Not compared to other doctors in other countries. But if you don't do your job and patients are not happy, they can submit a formal complaint and you're in a world of shit. And that's with any patient. And if your attitude is not brilliant, then you have to go through a lot of complaint procedures. Now, I've been lucky I haven't had any of those, but invariably at some point I will. And it's a constant fear in your head that you need to be acting, not really caring, but act in such a way that even if something was to come back at you, they would find nothing to hurt you. And it is about the numbers as well, because hospitals are getting paid by the numbers. It's not by the time as private practice is. So yeah, there is a problem with that.
There seems to be a rather strong argument, and you'll hear this often in the context of the United States, and I suppose in the UK as well, certainly in Germany, people almost universally say that private insurance is better. The doctor takes his time, I mean, because he's getting a lot of money. I mean, money motivates people.
Yeah.
But, not to spark some debate of public versus private, as Europe in general tends to have these public healthcare systems, they are perhaps not optimal, but not, they tend to be more affordable than private.
Yeah, absolutely.
And you just kind of have to suck it up and accept it. It's not going to be as good as private care or a doctor examining you who's being paid through private insurance. And I would never, fault a public doctor working in the public sector for being less than enthusiastic.
Well, you don't really have a choice in countries such as the UK.
Well, there is, to my knowledge, there is private insurance in the UK.
There is private insurance and there is private hospitals, but you have to work for at least 10 years, build up a name for yourself in the National Health Service, and then you'll go into private practice. It doesn't you can't just finish med school and then jump to private practice. You need to serve your time. So it doesn't really work like that. But personal experiences from friends, doctor friends that I have and all of that, the ones that can afford it, they always choose private practice.
Well, obviously.
Yeah.
If I could afford private practice, I would as well. On the other hand, I'm thankful that they usually just want to get me in and out as fast as possible. I don't want to be there either. So
yeah, I get that.
Now, getting to the darker aspect of things. Now, when you're doing, just this past weekend, you had long shifts, if I recall right, and we talked afterwards, and you sounded exhausted, uncharacteristically so. Now, you're dealing on those shifts with all kinds of things. I don't need specifics, but certainly when you're working a lot at the hospital, you're dealing with some pretty grave illnesses, I imagine, and sometimes death. So is there a transition? So you're driving to work, right? And then you're Niko. I mean, when you're driving. But then when you're at work, you're just the doctor, and you have the patients, which are these sort of machines in a way, and you got to make sure the machines are running and working. And then you leave, and is it a switch? You turn Niko back on. How does that work exactly, to your mind and your interpretation?
That is a good question. I've never really considered it.
Well, you should.
Yeah, I will say that you're probably right. I'm Niko even when I'm hanging out with the other doctors there. I try to be as open, discuss with them openly and all that. But once we get the lists out, we start talking patients, then you switch. And once you start seeing patients, you definitely switch. There is almost like a switch. I would agree with you. When you're seeing patients and when you're just having your conversations with people. Yeah, I will say so. It's not exactly like you're describing. You get in the car, you drive to the hospital, get out of the car, and then you're a doctor. But yeah, it is almost like that. If the situation demands it, then you turn into a doctor. And I've seen it even when I dealt with some patient that I found in the street. I just went for McDonald's because I'm advertising for a healthy living, and I found a patient on the street, just collapsed, and there were a bunch of people around him. And normally, I'm not going to go there and start, telling people what to do and all that, but not in my real life. But I went there, I knew what to do, I assessed the patient, gave some instructions to a couple of the people around, told them what to do, assessed the patient, waited for the ambulance to come in. And yeah, as soon as I was done, went home. No, there was no problem after that. The only complaint that I had, and that is a Niko complaint, was that just, my big tasty went cold, but that's about it.
Oh, it's for your own good. McDonald's is utterly disgusting. I haven't eaten there in about 20 years, but that said, it does seem, if it is a switch, a rather fluid one. You sort of have worked it into your own being in this fashion. Now, this is the darker aspect of things, but you deal with a lot of terminal illness and presumably with a lot of death. Do you find over time that you just sort of get numb to it all? I mean, specifically that aspect. The machine is alive and then it sort of is malfunctioned, just ceases working.
How can I describe this? I can give you a small story to describe exactly.
Stories are useful, yeah.
What I mean, yeah. Well, on one occasion, I saw a patient who came acutely in and was quite unwell. What we call peri-arrest, which means heart rate was really low. It was the waves on the ECG were just kind of irregular, and you could tell from the way that she was gasping for breath that she was just going to stop breathing at any point, and her heart would stop. We resuscitated that patient for hours, and I mean hours. I spoke to family members. I told them that things are not looking good. Then I went back and informed them again that things were not looking good. Gave a message to the one functioning side of her body at the time from one of her sons who was waiting outside. And then she eventually passed away. Now, when that happens, you should have some time to deal with things. But deal with things as in just put things into perspective. You're not going to cry. You're not going to do very much. We went back. We informed as a team the entire family what happened. They hugged me and told me things and all that, which I found very weird because I felt like I failed. At the end of the day, I took that personally. I always take things like that personally. But then I still had 8 hours in my shift. So you just put it in the back of your mind, went home after that shift, didn't really come across it, didn't really consider it until a long time afterwards. And it was when I had some time off and I went out and had something to drink, and I just felt really, really sorry for the family and for the person that passed away. But yeah, you're right. You just put it in the back of your mind and don't address it.
You spoke of failure, and I'm obviously not a medical professional, but I think I can disagree with you that the death of a patient necessitates being described as a failure. I mean, there clearly have to be cases where there's very little you can do, or probability is strongly working against you. And in such cases, it's hard to, from my perspective, looking at that as a failure. Right?
Theoretically, yes.
I mean, well, how about a more concrete example? I mean, we've described, we talked about privately, for example, how, the UK is the most obese country in Europe, at least. How so many problems, perhaps you said all of them. I didn't know if you were exaggerating or not, but
I was exaggerating slightly.
Yeah, but many of the problems.
The majority of them, yeah.
Yeah. Now, if a person, for whatever reason, has been leading a very unhealthy lifestyle, is, 40, 50 kilos overweight, doesn't exercise, eats a terrible diet, lots of fast food, lots of simple carbs, etc., that person is going and has a problem then, is going to the hospital with a prehistory that he basically has, through his own doing, essentially shifted the probability in his disfavor. So he's going to you having put a greater burden on you.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So I don't know if you can necessarily view that as a personal failure if you can't, save the 150-kilo man who has respiratory problems and coronary problems or whatever.
Well, I would agree with you that person probably caused the problems, on his own. I mean, you spoke as well about, free will and all that, and we all know that.
Okay, well, I want to just qualify this. For the purposes of discussion, this is related. It's always related, free will, but sometimes you have to use conventional terms.
I agree.
I wasn't implying that it was his. I don't think people are at fault for what they, for a million times I've explained this already. So obviously I'm not going to repeat myself, but I use through as doing as a euphemism. That is to say, there were circumstances external to you that, by the will of the gods somehow were imposed on him. He comes into the hospital with extra baggage, literally, a lot of extra baggage. That's making it more difficult for you to heal him and effectively save him. Now, if he kicks the bucket, if he dies, then it's hard to see. If I were there, and I can't put myself in your shoes necessarily, but I wouldn't see that as a personal failure. You do what you can, right?
Well, yes, I agree with you. I completely agree with the thinking and all that. But once a patient comes in and they come in under your name, that patient is your patient. And when they come in, especially with acute problems, I told you this before. For example, doctors almost take the blame on themselves, or at least I do, almost exclusively take the blame to heart in a way. If you do not treat someone quickly enough, if you do not do the appropriate treatment, or if you do absolutely everything right and the patient still succumbs to the situation that he or she brought themselves in, then it still feels as your fault. And when I say it's your fault, I mean that's what it feels like. It almost feels like a failure. Maybe it's the whole medical community that failed from the beginning. Maybe it's that person's fault. It doesn't really matter. At that point in time, it does feel like you failed. And when a patient dies or when a patient passes away in front of you, even if they come in with a gunshot wound on their heads and they still have a beating heart and they still pass away, you almost wonder, what could you have done better to prevent that? Even if you did absolutely everything right, followed all the guidelines, gave all the right medications and all that, you still wonder, could I have done better?
Well, coulda, woulda, shoulda.
Yeah, exactly.
This seems to me to be just a sort of an extension of the normal human policy of sort of regretting the past, even if it's just the immediate past. One often asks oneself, what could have been done differently? But I think that this is a helpful mechanism. I think it could be applied to medicine as well. Just that the past is done. I mean, I have my own sort of way of understanding these things. I mean, if you look at the past is but a memory, even if it's just 5 minutes ago.
Yeah.
It's a memory. Often our memories are terrible. That is, they're not accurate. But let's say they are. It still is just a place in the back of your mind. It's not actually part of anything. And the present is, well, ostensibly not even there, since it's always turning into the future. But, there's some vague notion of a present. The future is largely unknown. So I tend not to regret. I do my best to not regret anything, because it is as the gods will. And more importantly, it is a place that exists only in the recesses of my mind. Why couldn't that be applicable to the medical?
It should be. It should be, but it's almost like a form of reflection so that you can avoid doing the same mistakes again if mistakes were made in the future. Yes, it's a whole process.
Agreed. I mean, we can certainly learn lessons from the past.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that is a useful tool, right? To reflect upon that place in the recess of your mind that no longer exists. And I mean, for example, I would never get involved with a borderline personality disorder woman. I would become, Carl Lewis and run the other direction. it just wouldn't happen. So you can certainly learn lessons, and I think in that sense, it seems like it would be quite useful. But
there is no real regret there. You know it.
Yeah.
You know it. You might initially feel regret, but the regret, once you evaluate the majority of your actions, it goes away. I'm presuming that real regret will come if you really fucked up. And that is the medical term for it. When you fuck up, as a doctor, you feel like you took a knife and you pressed it on that patient's chest. That is the thing. And our mistake, I mean, there is a phrase that we bury our mistakes as doctors, and literally bury them. So and only you sometimes know the mistake, and you can never even go to prison for it, and it certainly hasn't happened to me, thankfully. But every doctor I've ever spoken to, having 10 years or more in the service, they will tell you that, you know, they remember the patients that they killed. That's how they would phrase it.
In essence, it's inevitability. At some point in time, by dint of human error, you're going to probably cause someone's death. And I think this is a good way to segue into how this all sort of started. Euthanasia is something that is, at least in the context of Europe, only legal in the Netherlands and Switzerland. And we can talk about the reasons why, but why don't you just tell us your perspective on euthanasia?
I mean, I'm a doctor in the UK, so you know how things are over here. But my personal opinion on it, I mean, I'm all for it. I'm very supportive of it. And I think that when the situation is such that a person is suffering and that's all they're doing, if it is their wish to end their suffering, instead of them using whatever means that, you know, that they have in their disposal, it's better if it is the doctors that do it. Yeah, absolutely. Now, I mean, I'm, of course, for euthanasia as well. That sounds so weird. I'm for it, but I think the option should always be available. There are a couple of difficulties I would acknowledge in the context of euthanasia. One, you have a terminally ill patient. That seems to be a clear case. You know, let him pass away without pain. Now, you might get someone who's chronically depressed, deeply, deeply depressed, but depression is all physical, but, you know, his vital functions are fine. He's only 30 or 25 or whatever, and he goes to you, says, into some theoretical scenario, you know, I want to be euthanized. Can you help me? I think there's a real sort of ethical dilemma in that case between respecting that person's wishes and saying, well, we could try other things. You know, you are depressed. Depression tends to cloud your view of things. Physically, in the general sense, you seem quite healthy. I think that is part of the difficulty of people dealing with euthanasia, because I don't think anyone would really have issues with euthanasia for terminally ill people, or people, you know, hooked human vegetables hooked up to machines. You'd be surprised. Well,
okay, you can tell me. I don't.
It's religion mainly that makes problems. You know, religious people value, and I value all human life as sacred.
No. Let's correct you there. Religious people don't value human life. They fear death. The fear of death is not valuing human life. It's quite the opposite. Because religious people who actually are convinced of this stuff, you know, in sort of mind-body duality and souls, in theory, sometimes I wonder how much self-doubt they have. I mean, in theory, it shouldn't be a problem, right? They're religious because they value life, but I think that they sort of, religious people actually revere death in a way, and so they don't really value life. And a person passing on to the next world is, despite their so-called religious conviction, quite terrifying. And so I can see why they would be motivated to keep human vegetables and the terminally ill alive, because they're so frightened of their forthcoming annihilation that they would just rather ignore the inevitable.
I mean, there's definitely truth in that, and there is religions that value human life. I don't think there is religions that don't value human life with regards to, as in, you shouldn't really end your own life. No one should have the right to take someone else's life away unless, they're of opposite religion.
I agree, but the idea of not, I mean, we're moving into separate territory, but I think people should have the right to commit suicide. I think...
I believe the same thing.
Well, I mean, to my knowledge, in the UK and other places, it's sort of illegal. I mean, it's not kind of after the fact. It's kind of a morbid, funny joke, right?
It's not illegal anymore, actually. It's been changed. The problem is, actually that if there is a mental health condition that, for example, depression, you mentioned depression before.
Right.
If there is a mental health condition that might be predisposing you in towards that line of thinking because of your mental suffering, which it isn't just mental, it's a physical suffering, etc. You're not sleeping, you're constantly in a state of apathy, there is no enjoyment in your life, you're constantly down, there is an argument that if you're mentally unwell, especially with conditions that predispose you towards suicide, then that is probably one aspect of the condition. Therefore, you're not in your right mind to be making that decision.
True. And I mean, certainly this is very relevant and germane to the UK. I mean, I don't know if the audience knows, many of you might know that the leading cause of death for men 35 or under is death at their own hand, that is suicide.
Yeah.
And this seems to me a very difficult issue to tackle because as men go in our own way, we're, of course, familiar with many of the reasons and the state of mind you have to be in. I mean, at the end of the day, as men, we are just sort of, we're invisible or only relevant when we're doing something. And this seems to me, in the largest sense, to be a reflection of that isolation that men feel. Because even when we're socializing, we're not really connecting with people because we're not allowed to.
Yeah.
I don't want to veer too away from the topic, but I mean that there doesn't seem to be a solution there, I think, and I just don't know. I think suicide should be freely available to anyone, but maybe after listening to the reasons, I mean, it's going to be a case-by-case basis.
Well, the fact of the matter is, for example, when people go for euthanasia in Switzerland, they always do a mental health care assessment. So they assess the mental state of the patient, make sure that the patient is not suffering from any depression or anything like that. And when they're well in themselves, at least mentally, then they can make that choice and make that decision for them. The reason for all of this, I mean, if someone is also depressed, a lot of people with a lot of chronic conditions and debilitating conditions, they have a high risk of actually developing depression. That doesn't mean that, for example, their decision is not right. All of that happens because they want to ensure that they will not be prosecuted for murder. All of this is just, a fine line. For example, what difference does it make if I prescribe the medication? Right? Because that's what happens in Switzerland. The doctor prescribes the medication is given to the patient, but then the patient needs to take the medication himself or herself, right? The doctor is not allowed to give that medication, not even in forms of injection or whatever, because that is an act of murder, and only governments are allowed to murder people.
Yeah. Sorry for laughing.
Well, yeah, it's true though.
Yeah. They say they're allowed to, so they are. They got the guns.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, as far as religion and suicide is concerned, I mean, most certainly monotheistic religions have, nominally speaking, I mean, the Muslims who blow themselves up are committing suicide, but it's not a suicide that's born of depression and sadness and not wanting to go on. Quite different. But so conventional suicide, of course, tends to be opposed. And once again, this is a greater issue for people. I mean, one of the primary reasons why euthanasia receives so much opposition, apart from the sort of difficulty of the ethics of it and the complexities we just talked about, is namely because a society that openly accepts this might be a society that openly talks about and feels near to death. And people forget. I mean, once again, the time we're living in right now, it doesn't get better, or it hasn't been. People talk about the good old days. No, now 2015, in the year of Zeus, it doesn't get better.
Yeah.
You go back a couple of hundred years, the amount of suffering, not just violence, but just disease, malady, suffering, it was just immense. So we, through our modern illusions and disguises, we've hidden death away. It's like this thing that's a monster that's been locked away in the basement, but it's constantly knocking and trying to break open the cellar door.
Yeah.
And euthanasia allows the monster to come out just a little bit more because people, they hear about it, then they see it, it's an option. And I think, particularly in the cases where the country is very religious, I mean, euthanasia, this was years ago, but I'll give you a story, and I don't remember the exact details. There was some woman in Florida, in the state of Florida, who was a total vegetable. I mean, she had just all machines. And there was a huge, the family, if I recall right, I don't remember her name, but wanted to take her off. I mean, they wanted to take her off a long time ago. But there was government opposition, religious opposition, and interestingly enough, the so-called people who value life, they're the ones who wish to prolong. I mean, you'd think they'd be happy, right? Her soul could float off, but no, they were the ones who opposed it the most.
Yeah.
And I think, in particularly religious societies, you're going to, like the United States, monotheistic Christianity in particular, you're not going to find people very partial to the idea of euthanasia because, once again, I believe ultimately that religious people are the people who tend to be most scared of death. They've accepted some of them accepted certain phantasms, some of them actually believe it, but many have sort of niggling doubts, and despite being religious, and to just let someone go reminds them of their own mortality and their own terror. So,
I'll give you another side of the story. I believe that Western society in general is not really in touch with death, right?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Completely oblivious to it. I remember I had to console one of my coworkers because she saw a dead person for the first time. And she just couldn't handle it. And I was like, what do you mean? You haven't seen a dead person before? And she was shocked. Shocked.
Was a nurse or an administrator?
Nope, a doctor.
A doctor?
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, really early on in her career. But
Right.
there is, even burials, there's no, you don't bury bodies anymore. Very rarely you do that, especially in big cities. People just get burnt, and all you have is ashes. Yeah, I know. Cremated is the right word, but I wanted to just make it as blunt as possible.
Okay, fair enough.
And all you have is ashes, so you don't really see anything, even with regards to that. And children are spared away from that reality because you don't want to make them not believe in Santa and fairies anymore. You want to spare them from that aspect of real life. So there is a lot of fear with regards to death. I mean, I wasn't spared of such occurrences when I was younger. So and my family was particularly interested in getting me to understand life, living and dying. That it is a circle. Start from
my family too. I mean, my parents have always been clear to me about last will and testament. They joke, I'm not going to be around forever. In fact, they would. I suspect in 10 years' time they'll probably both be dead, quite likely. Very open about it. Nobody had any delusions of immortality, and I wonder, the thing that people worry about, I suppose, is sort of traumatizing children with with these ideas. The child pulls at his father's shirt, Daddy, what's happening? And then he'll have to sort of, maybe he's terminally ill and say, oh, I'm not going anywhere. Instead of actually just saying, look, you remember that rabbit we saw that was on the road and it didn't move? Well, that's death,
Yeah.
Explaining these things. But I'm actually convinced that our unwillingness to socialize children properly to death, to just the hardships and disappointments in life, not just death, everything, to feed them fairy tales and delusions, under the auspices, mind you. When I worked at the warehouse, I had a female colleague that I actually got along with more or less quite well. We were sort of on friendly terms. And we'd argue about this all the time. And she said, children deserve to enjoy life and fun. I said, yeah, but they're going to only be children for such a long time, and they're going to have a potentially relatively long life ahead of them, where they're going to have to deal with these things. And by not dealing at this stage, it's going to be that much more difficult.
Yeah.
And so we feed our children, not our children, but children, delusions. We try to inoculate them, but not by actually confronting the issues such as death or sickness, human disappointment. We try to inoculate them by just hiding it all away from them. And akin to an immune system that's not used to certain viruses, if the immune system has no familiarity with it, it's going to be much more difficult to combat it. So I see a similarity there, and I don't think this is going to change any time. But if things were run by me, and I'm not saying I'm all-knowing, we would be talking in a very real sense to children about these things. Yes, of course, children's minds are fragile, but the idea of just not being familiar with these things at all, because I already knew about death when I was 5, if I recall right, and it wasn't a mysterious thing. Then a couple of years later, my grandfather at the time died, and it wasn't really shocking. I'd seen dead animals all the time, roadkill, and I remember reading about it and saying, so that's a dead deer, that's a dead rabbit. I guess a dead human wouldn't be all that different. I don't really see the distinction there. But I think we do all people ourselves a great disservice by hiding away these things in an attempt to inoculate and immunize ourselves to these things, when in reality we would deal with these things, I think, ultimately a lot better if we confronted them head on. We talked about death, we talked about disease, we talked about not being around forever. We talked about the immense human disappointments we go through in life, and I think that whatever hardship children might endure through that, they would be better prepared. They'd be able to deal with it better. I think it's just a better approach. But of course, that's just my opinion. I know people might vehemently disagree.
Well, experience aside, I don't have any children, but I've been a child, and just coming face to face with death, you don't really understand what's happening. You don't really think anything changes. You just know that, that person that you knew will no longer be around, and you just continue your life. I don't think we will be doing any disservice to them. It's just the adult perception that a child with no understanding or, concept of life or death, for that matter, even if you describe death to them, they will have an adult response to it, with the mourning and everything, which is completely stupid to think about it. And children might go through mourning, but it's not really the adult mourning. They won't go through depression. They will still wake up in the morning and still want to feed and just play around and do all those things. We are doing them disservice, and I think it's just that notion of innocence that a lot of people just want to...
Right. But children, I don't believe children are innocent. They are obviously have a long way to go as far as cognitive development is concerned and physiological development, but when Grandpa Smith departs, and then it said that he's still in heaven, or Lappy the Labrador or whatever, it's a bit absurd. And we have this false notion of innocence for children, and nobody should misinterpret what I'm saying. I'm not saying things should be done to children. I'm just talking about having honest, rational, sincere talks with them. That there are things that can rob children of their innocence. Obviously, violent sexual activity with children. I'm not talking about that, obviously. I'm talking about just saying, look, you could even do experiments. I mean, who cares about ants? You could have an ant. You could show a child. So you see this ant, it's moving. You crush the ant. It's not moving anymore. And you say, see, that was alive, now it's dead. And then you say, Grandpa Smith, alive, dead.
Yeah,
I don't know how that's the optimal way to go about it. Crush an ant is not exactly the same thing. Well, it is actually.
Well, it is exactly the same thing, but I don't think if that would be the best example. Just sacrificing ants or mice.
I'm still brainstorming how to reinvent the wheel as to raising children, but at least in this regard.
Yeah.
But
I think that the best approach, and I've seen it happen, with daddies that died, or mothers that died, or relatives that died. When children were around, I find that the best responses are usually from when those children, when those parents have honest conversations with their children, and they just tell them, look, daddy is not going to make it right now. He's very unwell, and he's probably not going to be with us. And I've heard them say this, and the children always ask questions because they don't understand what's going on. And when you tell them, like the fish that you had that stopped moving, and they go like, yeah, so it's going to be like that, and we won't be able to see daddy anymore. And they say things like that, and it seems to help. It seems to be like children understand. But I think having adults with no concept of death is just,
well, particularly religious adults. I mean, this is a cultural meme, effectively. You have a group of adults who have all sorts of religious delusions, and then they teach their children the same thing, and maybe they actually believe it, that the father or Lappy the Labrador went to the pearly gates of heaven or whatever, and it gets passed on and on and on. And I think what religion also does is it deprives people of the ability to mourn, especially if you actually believe this stuff. The idea that he's moved on to a better place doesn't actually give you the opportunity to miss the person properly and get over it eventually. You're always kind of stuck in this state in between. So
I mean, depending on the religion, and I do come from a very strong Christian background, and mourning was actually very promoted where I came from, and they do try to get people to go through the process, and people cry, they let it out, they understand, and it's a hope. It's a hope, I think, that they'll be in a better place. I don't think anyone truly believes that. Even if they say they do, you're just hoping. You don't know.
I disagree. I mean, not to change the topic too much, but when a Muslim suicide bomber straps explosives onto himself, I mean, I think you actually have to believe that you're going to ascend to heaven and glory to do that sort of thing. I mean, maybe some of them do have doubts, the ones that carry it out even, but most of them, I think, they actually have real conviction. I mean, there are certainly degrees. And if you're utterly religious and you're not amenable to any sort of evidence or reconsideration, then you might actually believe it. But I think, you're right. People have doubts. It's sort of a vague hope,
and not just
most of the time.
And not just that. I believe that if you have no concept of that your life ends in that moment that you die or whatever, ultimately your human body, right, is irrelevant. And if something is a sin, so for example, ending your life quicker or whatever, you prolong your suffering. And you do prolong your suffering because ultimately the suffering here will not be something that will be measurable in the life after. In the life after will just be pleasure and happiness and whatever, right? So I think, there is a problem, and it's definitely not a secular understanding. It's definitely not a clear understanding of the science of things. It doesn't. For example, I always think of this. You have a dog, and the dog develops cancer. The cancer starts eating away the dog's bones. The dog is in immense pain, is just suffering. You just euthanize that dog. That's what people do. That's the humane thing to do. Yet when it comes to humans, we do not do the humane thing.
Well, no, because we suffer from notions of human exceptionalism. I mean, there's no doubt that amongst mammalian species, we do have some rather unique features and faculties, or not even unique so much as a greater degree of them than many other mammals. But at the end of the day, we're a relatively hairless, in some of our cases, ape.
Yeah.
And however smarter we might be than Lappy the Labrador, there isn't a huge difference. And how to get to that point where, say, euthanasia would be completely accepted, I don't know. As long as we have to deal with religious people and their quote-unquote comforting beliefs, I don't think we're going to be able to get there. Now,
it's reached the point that religious beliefs nowadays, and I do feel strongly about this, they're just preventing science from progressing further.
Oh, well, I don't know in the States, I mean, I'm originally from New York City, so a lot of this stuff I've been to the South a few times. I mean, it's basically just stories, but if you move outside of large urban areas, particularly the Northeast is the least religious place in the United States, where I'm from, and you move to the South, it's this vast, all these plains and the Midwest, people are incredibly religious. They really believe this stuff, and you can actually become a pariah and be shunned by the community, apparently, if you don't go to church. Now, in some cases, I forgot which version of the many sects of Christianity it was, people have been refused or have refused blood transfusions because it went against their religious beliefs, and people then end up dying. Now, this seems to me that, well, it's just a huge hindrance, be it medical progression or scientific progression. It is
suicidal.
Yeah, but
Jehovah's Witnesses.
I think it was Jehovah's Witnesses.
Yeah.
But religion is not going away anytime soon. It's here to stay. This, of course, is not evidence for the truth of its claims, but it does provide a service to people who psychologically otherwise couldn't cope with life. And it's not, I don't have the attitude of who am I to deprive people. I will occasionally, I don't do it as much as I used to when I was part of the atheist community, discuss, or if need be, the religious material of people. But, it just seems to be a waste of time most of the time trying to convince people. And that, with the exceptions of a few people, I think religious people are very happy about modern medicine. They're not going to refuse these things usually. They might pray. I mean, people actually had conducted studies thinking that prayer might actually do something. But
well, it has the same effect as a placebo, which does have...
No. The studies were conducted basically random people, strangers, praying to see if that actually had an effect on recovery. There was, of course, no effect.
Of course not. But the patients themselves praying and really, really believing does have an effect on them. Exactly the same effect as when you're giving someone placebo medication. It does have some effect. And actually, if they've done studies, and the more painful the placebo, so for example, you give them a pill and you give them an injection with just sugar, they found out that the injection has more of an effect.
Yeah, well, I'm not doubting that. Yeah. But religious people tend to be happier than non-religious people. I mean, believing these things does have real consequences, but it's also a huge hindrance. Never mind all the cultural conflicts and problems that can arise from religion. I mean, you're in the UK, and there are problems there because of that, as you know. But segueing from that, as MGTOW-minded men, I did want to ask you a question about, frankly speaking, the difference between female doctors and male doctors, how they operate, how they react and interact with the patients. Have you noticed acute differences? Because I would assume there would have to be. Now, you're probably going to say, I've never really paid attention.
Well, not really. I always pay attention to these things.
Okay, fair enough.
I would say male doctors, and not all of them, right, seem to be a lot more decisive, and they seem to be gravitating towards fields that decisiveness is generally what is needed, to be in that field. So, for example, surgeons, the majority of them are male. People are saying that it's to do with the long training program, and perhaps it has something to do with it because it is in the middle of the female reproductive years. But I've seen the same thing when it comes to female, participation in environments such as accident and emergency, and other environments. So frontline medicine in general, if it's not a cushy job, right, you're not sitting on a chair, you're relatively safe and all that, females tend to not gravitate towards it. And I think that's a general conception of the whole world. Females generally go to something that's more
secure,
yeah,
safe,
not all of them,
and less stressful.
Not all of them.
No, I don't doubt that there are a few exceptions, but
yeah,
I think probably the vast majority of say, ER surgeons and what have you would have to be male.
Yeah, they are. That's factual. But when it comes to, let's say you have male and female interaction with patients, male interaction is usually more direct, more to the point. Females will ask more questions to do with social things that, male doctors don't really care about because that's not really fixing the problem. Well, sometimes it ends up being relevant, and that's the whole rationale of having two different types of doctors and three doctors seeing a patient before the final treatment is decided, so that you go through a lot of people that will ask different questions. But seeing them, I would say that male doctors are usually more direct, more to the point. They make their decisions slightly quicker. There is, of course, exceptions, and I've seen female doctors that were completely and utterly decisive. They knew exactly what was going on, and to memory, the best example that I have is a female surgeon that was, okay, the patient is like this, we're doing this, straight up, straight away. The decision was made in seconds, and I don't know if if she's a special little snowflake that is just better than everyone else, which is obviously a possibility, but that is generally the point. And usually females, I would say, they cry in the corridors. Males don't cry in the corridors. I've never seen a male doctor cry. I've seen around 10 female doctors cry this far. Especially first year of training, I've seen almost every single female doctor. I've seen them cry at some point.
Do you think because women tend to be more emotional and emotive and generally less decisive, do you think it's actually a negative having them, say, in the emergency room and having them operate alongside men? Let's speak frankly. I'm
speaking frankly, and
right.
You can try this with any person that male, female. If you come into an emergency department, if your life hangs in the balance, right, and you're close to death, all your vitals are fucked up, completely fucked up, and that's the medical term again, and you come in and you have the choice between the male and the female doctor in front of you, which one would you choose?
Oh, I know I would choose the male. I don't want a woman operating on me, frankly speaking. Yeah, I don't.
So, and I've asked this question to even female doctors that
they choose a man too.
Yeah, they do.
But that's sexism, right? Well, maybe it is, but I don't care. I don't. If I'm gonna be undergoing some really serious surgery, I get concerned. Even though most of the anesthesiologists I've dealt with have been female, oddly enough, no, not most, maybe half of them, I still get a little bit nervous when, frankly speaking, women are doing really important, because you can fuck up, as you know, as an anesthesiologist, and
Well, that is the point. It's not anesthesiology is more or less straightforward, and it's not me minimizing the effect of that specialty. It's just straightforward procedure. Usually, they just give you some propofol, they get you to sleep, they intubate you, they start the anesthetic that's going through and the machine, and that's it. You're good to go. And throughout the procedure, they just monitor your vitals and adjust accordingly. Now, when it comes to things where there could be a billion things wrong with you, right? and you need someone that makes the decision. You want someone that's decisive, that needs to think clearly about the situation, needs to see, for example, oxygen levels down, let's give some oxygen. Blood pressure is low, let's get a cannula and let's give some fluids. And that is a straight away problem-seeing, problem-solving attitude. And yeah, people generally choose male doctors. Generally, I mean, perceptions
women included.
Yeah, women included. I mean, you might speak to women on the street, and that might tell you that they would prefer a female doctor. But if you speak to female doctors, they would tell you if they were really unwell, they would choose the most qualified person. And I'm like, if you have no idea who's the most qualified person at that point, would you choose the man or the woman? Invariably, the answer always goes to the man.
Yeah, no, and of course there are going to be exceptions. I mean, there are women who work, power lines as well. There are not many of them, but this is something I think that it's so serious, surgery, that you can't afford to have these idiotic discussions about gender equality or whatever. I mean, people's lives are on the line. And the same thing applies, obviously, to firefighters and that don't meet the requirements or get passed kind of unreasonably. These are life and death situations. Someone's in a burning house and weighs 100 kilos. It's unlikely the woman's going to be able to, throw him over her shoulder. So,
well, not all women, but the really not stocky built woman might.
Yeah, maybe. But how many of them are also fit enough to do the running up the stairs? And so I think I'm unapologetic about this when it comes to serious life altering, life saving activities. If the person's proven, fine, but if I have to choose, I'm going to choose a man every time without exception. That includes pilots, that includes surgeons, that includes firefighters, it also could police. I sometimes I'll walk through the streets of my neighborhood, and Germany has a lot of quotas for police officers. There's so many female police officers, and I'm not a particularly big guy, but they just look, frankly speaking, pathetic. I mean, how are they supposed to do the job?
Well, they have a gun.
They have a gun.
And they're inclined to use it. That's the problem. That's the problem. If you're smaller than someone else and you need to enforce the law, you end up shooting that person, right?
Yeah. Well, I'm not implying that men are perfect. It's just, by any means, it's just if the doubts are there, if we don't know, men are just do a better job at this stuff, be it policing, firefighting, surgery, flying. There are going to be exceptions, and if a woman proves herself, she should be part of whatever team. But when you reach the areas where life and death hangs in the balance, we don't have time to talk about feminist gender equality bullshit. People's lives are on the line, and it's just something that needs to be thrown out the window. This is a luxury to talk about this stuff, and it has no place in serious situations.
Well, that is why, for example, the training for surgeons, medics, whatever, it's always fixed. So the people that are fully qualified always have to go through exactly the same things. There is no gender, let's say, gap in that one.
Let's hope so, because in firefighting, they've allowed women to have less stringent requirements. The same is true as military service and so on. So, I mean, it's bad enough we have to deal with the feminist nonsense in the political and academic sphere, but I just hope that it doesn't encroach into these very, very important areas that are so vital to people's lives and maintaining life.
The problem with a lot of the things is that you're not always seeing someone that's fully qualified, especially doctors. A lot of them, the majority of patients, especially National Health Service, etc., and that's in public health service everywhere in the world, you'll be seeing, the first doctor that you will be seeing is a trainee. And the trainees might just be there, hate the job, whatever, and they're definitely not qualified enough to make all of the decisions, but they end up having to make a lot of the decisions that may invariably change people's lives for the better or the worse.
Oh yeah, I mean, I'm lucky that my tumor and most of these salivary gland tumors, particularly of the
Submandibular.
Submandibular. Keep on fucking forgetting. I know the German term, but submandibular type tend to be benign. But if it hadn't been, and getting falsely diagnosed 3 or 4 times in a row with some sort of swollen lymph node thing, and even then, as you pointed out once, that if you have lymph nodes, the golf-sized ball or whatever, that's a problem, and they didn't really see it as a problem. So
yeah, they should have seen it as a problem. Yeah. I mean, there is a lot of things that can go wrong, at least in medicine, and it always astonishes me how things go right most of the time. I think depending on your luck, and I'm talking about luck, you find 3 people, male, female, doesn't matter, who just don't give a shit, just want to go home or whatever, and all those 3 people see you, and they don't pay attention to you, don't really look for the signs or whatever, you might end up being seriously hurt.
Yeah,
and there will be nothing in their documentation to suggest that they've done any mistake at all, so they won't even be prosecuted for it. If you haven't seen something, you haven't seen it, and that's how things are. People can miss things, but you do know, as a doctor, you do know that your attention span goes down and deteriorates with the time that you're working.
That's true of anything, though, isn't it?
Absolutely, exactly. And it's almost like people have this concept in their heads that we're special human beings, and we're not. We're not even to the closest. So it does really matter who you see, at what point you see them, etc. If you're gonna end up having to suffer.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, folks, we've talked at length now, but as always, thank you for listening and watching. I thought that was a quite interesting talk. I consider myself personally privileged. I consider Niko a good friend, and doubly privileged that he's a doctor, because I can get my rectal examination from. I'm just kidding.
I'm saving my right index finger, man. I'm getting a glove.
Yeah, get the glove and hit that prostitute. Anyway, as always, thanks for listening, and we'll see you guys soon if Zeus wills it. So, bye-bye.